Hi, this is my action plan. I decided to do it over video just because I think it's easier for me to explain in words versus in type. So these next few steps that I have laid out, these are what would happen before any discussion takes place in the classroom over race. So these kind of just set up the classroom environment and what I want my environment to be like in my school for myself and for my students. The first step that I would take would be to discuss with my principal and my grade level team about what I'm doing. I just really want to make sure that I'm letting everybody around me know what's going on, so that way I'm kind of covered if a parent comes and talks about why we're doing this, they know. And so just laying out, the standards that I'm going to be looking at and how this relates to the standards that we teach. It's just honestly so that I'm covered on all ends. And then for my grade level team, it really just gives me a better idea of what I want to do and how I want to implement. I'm the youngest person on my team, and so they definitely would have a better understanding of what could I do to make sure that my kids feel safe, and what could I do to make sure that every student participates or feels like they can participate. My next step would be to investigate my own understanding of race, so just really self-reflection on what I believe about school and how that might not actually be what's best for my students, or why am I actually doing it. And so I don't want to be subconsciously influencing something or implementing something in my classroom that I don't actually agree with, or if I really thought about it, I wouldn't agree with. And so just in a broad sense, critical pedagogy, just investigating more. But for this topic specifically, just what's my understanding about race? What biases or preconceived notions do I have about race? And then I also want to add more multicultural books to my library. I think books are a really good starting point for students, and it really allows them to, they can relate to the character instead of putting some of their worries or their thoughts on themselves. And I think that really helps students. And so adding more multicultural books to my library. And I would do this through Donors Choose. I think that would be the best option, just because I would just want a few books right now until I have a deeper understanding. And so they would just be getting me started on race, and having my students kind of dive deeper into that themselves. And I will be using some of these for my future action research as well. For example, Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds is the book that I'm going to be reading as a class, and so it'd be really nice to have a class set for my students. And then these are some other books that I think would challenge students and try to get them to think deeper about the way that society is set up, and just systemic and institutional racism and white privilege and white power. And so these would kind of get the basis of these. And these are chapter books specifically. And then on this next page here, I have picture books that I would want to receive as well. So getting, the story of Ruby Bridges, or Let's Talk About Race, Separate is Never Equal. So different picture books that could also encourage talking in my classroom as well. And then finally, the last thing that I want to do before really diving into the race discussion would just to be establishing a safe classroom community. I think it's really important that students feel safe in their classroom. And throughout all the articles I read, almost every single one of them talked about establishing a safe community in the classroom, so that they can feel like they can talk and not feel afraid of saying something wrong or something that they might say. So really pushing this at the beginning of the year and doing community builders and just things to get to know each other in the classroom. And then also just making sure that I have clear expectations when it comes to having students state their opinion or state their belief, and just so that all of my students are clear on what needs how they should react and respond to each other when somebody is sharing their opinion. And then also just using like accountable talk, like some of the things on this slide. So using like, I agree with this person because, or I disagree because. And I do have a bulletin board for my classroom as well that has all these stems laid out, and hopefully getting a little like tag for their desk so that they can always like have them in their mind and be prepared to use them. It also invites other students in. So if they see somebody that's not participating as much, they can invite them in. Like, can you explain what this means? Or, so-and-so, what do you think about this? And so making sure that everyone has a place to talk, and really having them want to talk about these things. And I think that starts with having a safe classroom community. And then, so the next few steps are the steps that I would be implementing after the previous ones are done. And the steps that I'm implementing could be used for race talk, but it also could be used for any other topic that we go into during the school year. That's kind of just a broad oversense of what we could talk about. So the first thing I would do is I would bring in some literature. So reading a story such as the story of Ruby Bridges, and it could be a different story as well, but a shorter picture book that kind of gives a historical perspective on race, because though racism is still going on now, I think students can kind of like connect to some of their background knowledge and bring in some of those things without feeling so like, this is happening right now, this is where I'm at right now. And so giving them more of like this in history, this is what happened. And so some discussion questions that I could pose after we read this that they could talk about in small group. We could talk about, what character traits did Ruby Bridges have? Why do you think that people were upset about not having segregated schools? Why is what Ruby did brave? What is special about her teacher? And what is in common between the white people and Ruby? And so bridging some of those concepts that still apply to issues today, but using it in a historical context first, what I think would be a good way to ease students into all the conversations that we will be having in the future weeks. Another thing that I would do towards the beginning, and this is not like day after day what we're doing, this is probably like do one thing a week to slowly get them comfortable with doing this. So I would also have students debate, but I would give them their sides so they don't feel like I have to state my personal opinion and I have to state what I believe, and that gives them fear. I know that I would feel like that myself. So having students debate, but I tell them what side they have to be on. So I could, for this topic specifically, I would give one side maybe, should people be seen as the same color? So the idea of colorblind. And then another one could be, should people be seen as the race that they are? And so having them debate those sides and kind of argue about which one is better. Is being colorblind better, or is not being colorblind better? And so really having them debate those two sides would, I think, give them, first, more conversation points, but also, when they know that they have to be on this side, it puts the pressure off of them. Sorry, my computer froze. There we go. The next step would be to read Long Way Down. So this novel is actually a little bit above my students' age range for appropriateness, according to Common Sense Media. But when I was reading it, I really do think that my students could relate to it, and I think that they could really connect with it, and I could find some really good discussion points for it. If it would pop up, you would see it. It's by Jason Reynolds. And so then every day that I would read it, it would probably take me about a week to read. Every day the students would write a summary and then a question over what they read. And then I would definitely let them do it with a partner, and I would leave it open to their interpretation of what a summary means. So I wouldn't specifically say they have to write it, verbalize it in some way. And so just making sure that I give them the opportunity to be themselves in this activity, but having them summarize in some form every day. And then throughout, they were developing their own questions over the book, which is just critical thinking. And then at the end, I could have them pair up and talk about some of the questions that they wrote down as they were reading for the book. And so they could one partner for one question and then talk about it, and then go on to the next person and next conversation, just so they get a variety of people. But I also said friend because I want them to be comfortable with who they're sharing with, if this is towards the beginning of the year. The next thing that I want to do is culture circles. And so the first thing that I would have to do when establishing a culture circle is all the students would be sitting in a circle, and we would be talking about one theme or one issue. And so I would definitely establish the guidelines first. So some of my guidelines would be: listen respectfully to the people around you. Make sure your language is kind and appropriate. Ask questions. So my students should be asking the questions to facilitate the conversation or to clarify what somebody thought. They need to share time fairly, and then also using accountable talk to disagree or to invite other people to speak. And so establishing those guidelines and making sure that they're clear. And then I could also I may implement a talking piece if I feel like my class needs a little bit more guidance and they need a little bit more structure. That way the only person that is holding that talking piece is the only one that can talk. And then I will be there to either move an idea along if it's being really repetitive, or to ask a question to get people to think deeper. So getting my students to think a little bit more deeper about what race is and how to do, or how to converse about race in a way that makes us less uncomfortable talking about race. And then finally, family involvement is also really important. And I think that the majority of this is going to be done through take-home activities. And so this way the families can be engaged in some of the harder topics that we're talking about. And so an example for 1 week could be, where do you still see discrimination today? And so having the parents think about where they see discrimination in their lives, because the majority of my students are minority. And then also just having the students think about, where do I see discrimination? And then another question could be, why is it important to talk about race? What is white power? What is white privilege? So these are questions that they can take home to their family to really facilitate a deeper level of understanding. And so that would be my action plan, pieces of it. And so for each topic that I do choose, I can switch up the books that I read, and some of the activities that I do. But I think the culture circle is really good for establishing a safe environment for students to talk in, which was important. And then also just making sure that everybody has a voice and they can be heard, and it's not a place for judgment and not a place for to worry about the way that you're phrasing things, because you can address that as it comes up. You can address those maybe misuse of words or misphrases as they come up, because they are fifth graders and they're going to mess up and they're going to say silly things just like I do and just like every other adult does. And so just making sure that it's clear that it's okay and it's still a safe environment.